Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's discussion of Wuthering Heights, the 1939 version with the tall and brooding Laurence Olivier, as you can see right on your screen. We look forward to discussing this, and I wanted to welcome my colleague who suggested this film, Jacob. Jacob, how are you tonight?
I'm well, thanks, Andrew. I'm looking forward to discussing Wuthering Heights with you and with everybody else.
Yeah, thank you for suggesting we all revisit this. It's a really great choice. I'm so glad I saw it again. Before we get to the content of our discussion, just a little review of our procedures. Please keep your audio on mute while the discussion is going on. If you have a comment or question, please use the raise hand function within Zoom. You can see it marked on your screen by the number 2 there. And then I will call on you, at which point please unmute yourself and state your question or comment. And then please remute yourself while Jacob and or I respond to it. I will do my best to get to everybody once, and possibly if you have other comments a second time, but I answer them in the order that the hands appear, so just be patient and I will get to you. We also have the chat function working tonight, and our colleague Jill is monitoring that. So you can talk amongst yourselves in there, you can raise other issues for discussion, and you can let us know where you're from if you're from outside the greater Philadelphia area. And if you're from really far outside the greater Philadelphia area, please visit the Where in the World page within the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org and let us know where you're from and how you found us and how you think we're doing. You can see from this graphic that we've had folks from all over the country and all over the world join us. So if you're one of those folks, we'd love to hear from you. And with that, I think we are ready to get started with tonight's discussion. I see we have our usual first commenter up first. David, how are you tonight?
I'm great. And Jacob, thank you. Janice and I are in the middle of rewatching Pride and Prejudice and being able to, in many respects, compare and contrast some of these old British novels that have been moved into film, how differently they define heroes and villains. And I just had so much fun watching this and sort of trying to compare different aspects of these British, I'll call them love stories, even though there's so much tragedy in them as well. And sort of comparing and contrasting the class differences in Mr. Darcy as compared to Heathcliff, and yet how brooding they both are. Sort of wondering whether either of you have any great thoughts on the differences of bringing these characters from that age, Great Expectations, Jane Austen, and this into movies at different times over the last, I guess it's more than half a century now. So thank you again. This was just great to watch, great acting, and some of those who became true classic actors over time. And this was somewhat early in some of their careers for Laurence Olivier, for example. So thank you.
Well, thank you, David. That's an interesting question or sort of thought exercise you posed to us about thinking about the sort of bringing to the big screen of these, sort of, I guess, 19th century British novels. Jacob, did you have any thoughts off the bat in response to David's prompt?
Sure. So, I mean, first of all, very glad that you enjoyed the movie, and I think it must be it's excellent timing if you're in the midst of a Pride and Prejudice rewatch. Very interesting to look at the differences in Austen and Bronte too. Both of those writers, this Bronte rather, both of those writers, as many of the writers of that period and that region focused on, looked at often dealt with landed gentry, with dramas of marriage and romance. But as we can see in this film, there's a very dark streak to it too. There's a darkness and a sort of wildness and a sort of crazy energy to Emily Bronte and her vision. And I think that comes through in the film as well, which is something that I think makes the work unique among works sort of in that style and of that period. Now, in terms of bringing it to film, one thing that I think is notable in Wuthering Heights, the book, and in Wuthering Heights, this movie, and in many of the other adaptations, is the role of the landscape and the outdoors in the drama and in just setting the mood and the tone. The landscape is a palpable force, and there's a wildness that sort of comes through with some of its characters. And that's something that many of the filmmakers who have tackled this, including William Wyler and his cinematographer, Greg Toland, that's something that many of them have picked up on. In this film version, we can see the ways that Greg Toland really, I think, skillfully captures this intense, tempestuous, dark atmosphere of the Yorkshire moors, and various other people who've filmed this story have picked up on those sort of sensory details as well. Andrew, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I first in what you were saying and in watching the film, I was thinking of the wisdom of people like Adolf Zugor and the Warner Brothers in choosing Southern California and the Los Angeles area as the place for their operations. I mean, sure, they were smart because of how many days of sunlight a year there were, and necessity of that for early photography, cinematography. But the other big selling point was the various geographies or I guess topographies within a relative stone's throw from Hollywood. And this is a great example of that. For while I know it doesn't look like, the place in England where it's supposed to very much, it does provide an effectively analogous sort of physical setting for this story. And this was mostly filmed in a state park in Thousand Oaks, and I think of that. I just sort of think that's hilarious. I can only imagine what that area looks like today. But I think that more to David's point, the part of the reason these novels are still read today and are still held in the regard they are and are as popular and are as a popular source for adaptation as they are is because presumably there is some central human truth that they reveal or convey or embody. And in a sense, if that quality is captured in some sense in the film version or any adaptation of such a story, then the film itself should be able to be viewed far beyond the time in which it was made. And in that regard, despite all the changes and the truncations to the novel, I think this film version can be deemed very successful, because I think it does get to some of those core elements of human behavior and romance, and desire and self-destructive tendencies and all those things. And despite the particularities and limitations of Hollywood in 1939, I think those elements of the story and of the film hold up. And for that reason, that is about as much as you can hope for from a film adaptation, which necessarily, because it presents so much more than the reading of a novel does. It presents so much more definitively, as opposed to a reading of a novel, which allows us to fill in so much speculatively. For it to be lasting in that regard, I think is in some ways a greater achievement. Kathleen, you have a question or comment?
Hi. I have to tell you, when I opened my email on Thursday and saw that you were doing this movie, I was so excited. I couldn't contain myself. This is one of my all-time favorite movies. And I enjoyed watching it this time as much as I did the very first time I watched it. And I'm looking forward to the discussion too, that will shed even more light on it. I think one of the things that I noticed this time was the contrast in tone and spirit between Wuthering Heights and the Grange where the Lintons live. And that was often perceived through windows. So we see Kathy and Heathcliff running into the garden when the Lintons were having a big party and peering over the windowsills and trying to get in and see what's going on. And so there's the comparing and contrasting of their passion and the staidness of the Lintons and the different social strata they occupy. And I just found that very intriguing to me. And it really told a lot of the story the way I saw it. So I just thank you so much for picking it. And the next one you could pick is Jane Eyre. Thank you.
Thanks for the suggestion, Kathleen. Jacob, is there anything that Kathleen's comments made you think about sharing?
Yeah, certainly. So glad that you enjoyed a rewatch and that this is a film that you love, as do I. So yeah, lots of good stuff there. Right, the difference in the world between Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange, that's a mouthful. You know, the visual contrast. William Wyler's such a great sense of scene, of place, and the sort of contrast between the unruly beauty of the landscape around Wuthering Heights, the sort of grim Gothic interior of, you know, that manor itself, and then the very immaculate but sort of bland interior of the luxurious Linton household. I'm also so glad that you brought up windows, which I think are a very interesting visual motif and thematic motif in the film. Certainly one of the themes that we come across in this film in many ways is these sort of different worlds and characters who are looking into different worlds and experiencing the separation and the borders and boundaries between different worlds, different social classes, and also sort of different phases of life and different modes of relationship. And the window sort of serves that function as both the looking glass and the boundary. And it's an interesting theme too, because, you know, in the central relationship of the film between Heathcliff and Kathy, we see this relationship that sort of transcends all these different boundaries and rules and differentiations in a variety of different ways. I imagine we'll talk about that more as we go. But the sense that, you know, their love and their relationship sort of crosses these various boundaries and in some ways transcends it and in some ways transgresses these different boundaries. And ultimately at the end, or by the conclusion of the film, is transgressing the barrier between life and death. And so I think it's significant that in the very first leg of the film, the incident that sort of really gets things moving is that Lockwood, the dorky guy who comes to stay at Wuthering Heights in the snow, reaches out of the window. He reaches through a hole in the window. It's a broken pane, and something grabs him, or so he thinks. So it's this, you know, the sort of whole story of Heathcliff and Kathy begins when this sort of barrier is penetrated. Andrew, I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah, I think that that was a wonderful point that Kathleen made, and it calls to mind the frequent use of windows and doorways as these dividing points to separate those who are on the outside and those who are on the inside. I feel like we see a lot of those in romantic dramas and melodramas. I think about Stella Dallas and Stella having to watch through the window from the snow at her daughter's wedding. She can't go inside for much of the same sort of what we would say today, I think, are, kind of baseless reasons that we see in something like Wuthering Heights, the similar reasons to why Heathcliff and Kathy are outside in that scene that we were just talking about. So I think there's a lot of that. I also really appreciated the larger point about the differences between the two homes that was sort of at the core of the last comment. I thought about often when I watched this film, but particularly when I noticed the stark distinctions. I noticed it more after we had been at I'm not as familiar with the literature, so I'll just refer to the things by movie stars. After we were at David Niven's house for a while, we went back to Laurence Olivier's house for a while. Not just the difference in space and the windows and the openness, but the light and the dark. The Olivier place is filled with all this dark wood and these lower ceilings, and is very often cloaked in shadow. And the opposite is true of Niven's place. And it reminds me that part of the reason that contrast comes out is the set design, right? And the art direction. But part of it is the cinematography. And Greg Toland, whom many of you know, was one of the most acclaimed cinematographers of all time. He's shot The Grapes of Wrath. He shot, so the year after he made this, he did Grapes of Wrath, and the year after that, he did Citizen Kane. And you can see in this film that the Wuthering Heights is shot just in more darkness. And it's shot in such a degree of shadow and darkness that is really uncharacteristic for Hollywood at this time. This is still very much right in the heart of classical Hollywood cinema, when there were unwritten rules about not confusing the audience, not running the risk of disorienting the audience, of giving everybody a clear view of everything as if they were an 8th row center in a big theater. And the idea that there would be so much shadow obscuring things, and you even see it in moments of sadness or disapproval within Niven's house as well. I think about the argument at the end where Geraldine Fitzgerald, and Merle Oberon have it out about the former's loving Heathcliff and wanting to marry him. You see shadow fall on Merle Oberon there. You see shadow fall on David Niven there. And the idea that should happen to particularly Oberon, your leading lady, your main movie star, would have gone against some unwritten rules. But it was very effective storytelling, and done with the fine calibration by an experienced cinematographer like Toland. So it all works. But what Jacob was saying about the physical locations, the settings being so important, and film being a good, if it's done well, being a good medium for those to come through is never truer than those moments I mentioned. Judy, you have a question or comment?
Hello.
Judy, are you there?
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hi.
Please go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thanks, Jacob, for selecting this movie. It's a wonderful movie. I love it. I've always loved it. Of course, I cried at the end. But I think I brought different eyes to viewing it this time. And I want to really speak about Laurence Olivier a little bit. I found the film to be this time much more fantastical, otherworldly, not like a love story, but something other than that. And I thought that Olivier, in the early part of the film, as the young stable boy, was more almost a caricature of himself, awkward and sort of out of place, didn't really, and I thought that the relationship between him and Kathy in the beginning was awkward. But toward the end, when at the turning point, when he comes back and he's a wealthier, established, more refined person, the real Olivier came out. And then I think it takes you all the way to the end, and the dying love scene between Kathy and Heathcliff at the end is sort of so very, very passionate, because it's Olivier being this amazing, amazing force and this great actor, and his bearing and his speaking. I just wanted to comment about that.
Well, thanks, Judy. I'll just say, if I can jump in, that I found I didn't find Olivier's performance in the beginning to be a caricature any more than I found myself looking back, or many other young men in their teens and 20s to be caricatures of angry young men themselves, right? I mean, I think that's part of the point of the character, that he's completely unbridled. And that's part of what thrills Kathy, and that's part of what frustrates or enrages the others around them. And I think he gets a bit of a handle on it as he gets older, and there's more of the brooding and the seething, sort of under the surface. But I found it to be a credible development, and a believable character. Certainly, I would say this somewhere this side of caricature. But Jacob, what do you think?
Well, I think that's well put, Andrew. I'll just add, I don't know, one thing that in the roles or at least I associate Laurence Olivier with, he often plays these very dapper, very genteel, very well-mannered parts. I really like being able to see him in this film, both doing some of that in the second part of the movie, and in this sort of more rugged, more furious, more unruly mode. I think it's and I think he manages to bridge those two very well. This was the role that really established Laurence Olivier as a screen actor. He had been very successful on stage to this point, and he had done some films before this, but he hadn't really been able to translate the success that he'd had on stage and the sort of appeal that he'd had on stage into the cinema. This is the film where he sort of broke through. In fact, I believe he was nominated for an Oscar for his performance. And he credited William Wyler with teaching him essentially how to act for the camera. And one thing that I don't know if this is so or not, but I wonder if having to sort of play that, that stable boy, that unruly, unkempt, kind of awkward, kind of raging character at the beginning stretched him in some interesting ways that helped him. So, but thank you for your comment. I'm glad that you enjoyed revisiting this one.
But before we get back to the people with their hands raised, there have been a couple of comments in the chat about this being a depiction of a pathological romantic attachment and Heathcliff being evil. And I don't disagree with either of those assessments. I think that I think that this shows a very destructive romance and the destructive power of romance. And before the discussion started, Jacob and I were chatting about it, and I was struck by how really grim and dark and unsavory of a story this is. And you think about that being told in Hollywood in 1939, it's quite striking. Now, it has the protection of being a period piece, so there's some distance there. It has the protection of being based on a beloved and critically acclaimed work of literature, so that gives it some protection. And it has the nominal protection of that ending with the two sort of spirits going up the ridge, which has nothing to do with the book. But yeah, I think this is a really dark story, and there are plenty of romances throughout Hollywood that don't have happy endings, but still don't show romance to be as dark and destructive as this one does. So I think two things can be true. I think it can be a powerful and sweeping depiction of romance, but that power can be shown to be a destructive force. And I think that's at least partially the case here. Sue, do you have a question or comment?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I am in the middle. Well, I'm almost finished reading the book right now. And for those of you who haven't read it, I think it's very interesting to read the book after having just seen the movie. And it kind of follows up a little bit with the conversation we were just having. I think the characters are way more sympathetic in the movie than they are in the book. And my question really was regarding, they don't have the second generation of characters in the movie. And can you comment at all about why that decision was made?
Sure. Jacob, do you want to take this, or should I?
I can take it. Maybe you have some background that I don't have also, but I haven't heard or read any of the participants speak directly to the question of why they truncated it. There is, as was alluded to, the amount of story that we see in the film, it makes up about half of Wuthering Heights, the book, and the saga continues for a whole other generation in the kind of aftermath of Heathcliff and Kathy's dark romance. But I will say that having seen several adaptations of the film, it is pretty common to truncate it this way. Some of it, I think, is because the first half of the book is maybe a little bit more of a streamlined story, and things get very complicated in a number of ways, including with characters who have similar names to characters who have appeared before, and there are these sort of weird echoes and rhymes that happen throughout it. And some of it being that there is a romance story in here. It is a complicated, dark, I think, romance story. But there is the armature of a sort of classical Hollywood arc or form that is in the first half of the book in a way that I think is less present in the second half of the book. So that would be my guess. Andrew, do you have any insight into it?
Well, I have some thoughts, but before I share them, there's something I was wondering about that you might know, Jacob. I've never read the book. So is the second generation, the second half of the story, I should say, as concerned with class as the first half was?
Complicated. In some ways, in other ways they break the patterns, but it's complicated.
Because my only point in saying that was, I think that there is some appeal in Hollywood at this time to tell stories that involve people changing classes, socioeconomic classes is what I'm referring to. People changing socioeconomic classes, people seeing the virtues of working class people, the folly of the idle rich, and the importance of the well-to-do having a sense of social responsibility. Because this is the Depression, and the extent to which the beginning part of this story which allows them to show, you know, Heathcliff being taken in by a very benevolent man who is clearly of means, but not of as many means as the people down the way, perhaps, to show the folly of the waste of wealth that Kathy's brother is a constant reminder of, and to show the changeability of class station, as happens with Heathcliff over the course of the film, might have been part of the benefit of only showing of choosing this portion of the story. The other thing I will say is that Hollywood really, it took a lot for Hollywood to make an exceptionally long movie at that time. It also took a lot of resources, which were something that my understanding is Samuel Goldwyn, the producer, didn't have a tremendous amount of at this time. Beyond that, what Jacob said about it becoming difficult perhaps for an audience unfamiliar with the novel to be able to keep track of the characters is a real concern. As I was saying earlier, Hollywood's very reluctant to challenge their audience in any significant way at this time in particular. So for all those reasons, I think we can touch on some of the possible motivations behind the story having the structure and limitations it does. Janice, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I do. Related to what you're talking to about class, the thing that I thought was really pivotal in the movie was the death of the father. And they even made sure that you were going to notice that Wuthering Heights was a happy place before that. And I noticed the difference in lighting in Wuthering Heights, as you were talking about before as well, after the death. But the whole movie could have been possibly completely different if the father had not died, because he was the one who seemed to poo-poo the difference in class. I mean, his son would have liked him never to have brought him home in the first place. And, I thought a lot about that, how the whole story could have gone differently. Perhaps she didn't have the kind of father she did. She wouldn't even have considered him at all. And the other thing about the love story itself and her choices, which of course, as a romantic, I and maybe many people would have always wanted her to find a way to be with him, to be with Heathcliff, but he really didn't give her many opportunities to choose him. I mean, he didn't tell her, I'm going to find a way to support us. I mean, it really seemed like an impossible thing. So those were the comments I wanted to make.
Yeah, no, I think this is one of those movies that can really, well, I'll just speak for myself. This is one of those movies that that helps clarify or crystallize the extent to which I think one is or isn't a romantic, or maybe I should say instead, how much romanticism does or doesn't dominate one's personality, because the Linda in the comments says, isn't this as much about true love versus materialism and true love kind of winning out? In a sense it is, but I don't know if I would consider it winning. And I also would say that what you're saying, Janice, is you're sort of right. I mean, Heathcliff really didn't seem interested in making it easier for Kathy to choose him. Yes. Right? There seemed to be almost a spitefulness or an indignation to every choice he made that was almost, in a way, a sort of a test. This is one of those movies where I would say, much as I did for people who who are in my generation might understand this reference. I think there's a good case to be made that, you know, even though Kathy sort of temporarily, or not for temporarily, but yeah, I guess temporarily chooses the David Niven character, that he shouldn't have been seen as the second choice. He was, to my mind, the better choice. I mean, not only, let's leave the materialism out of it, he treated her better, right? And
Yeah.
and that should count for something. And to my generation, I think of the movie Reality Bites. There's these two movies have probably never been compared before and probably never will be again. But in that movie, there's the sort of, you know, there's the practical and successful Ben Stiller character and the poet musician Ethan Hawke, which may be redundant. And he's terrible to the Winona Ryder character, but the film makes the one who's terrible to her the quote unquote right choice. And I didn't see that then, and I don't understand that in this movie either. I think that, you know, the heart wants what the heart wants, and I get all that, but, you know, how one is treated by the object of their affection should matter. And it doesn't seem to as much in this film as one might hope.
Well,
Jacob.
yeah, these are really interesting points, and I think we're getting to some of the big questions of the film and of the story in general. So before, I want to speak to the to the question of romance and the sort of choice between, you know, worldly comfort and materialism and so forth, and this intense, you know, true love or whatever we want to call it. But first, I want to make a point about the other topic that was raised in the question, which is class and, you know, the question of the father. So I think this is a very interesting point, you know, because one of the things that we see that starts to bring things, you know, down at Wuthering Heights is when Hindley, the brother, becomes the man of the household, and he regards Heathcliff as less than, and sort of condemns him to the stables. But it's not just the fact that for Heathcliff that he's poor. It's also, I think we have to make notice of, that he's not white. His racial background is not articulated, but throughout the film, we see characters refer to him as the sort of, you know, racial other. Oftentimes people refer to him as a gypsy, whether that is, you know, whether they're referring to him as somebody from Roma descent, or, you know, or as a stand-in, I don't know. And there are various theories about what Heathcliff's origins might be. But this is something that also keeps him separated from the society. And it's very interesting to note that when Heathcliff arrives at Thrushcross Grange, having elevated himself to their economic equal, he's still not accepted. He's still other. He can't be accepted. Linton describes him as a surly lout playing dress up or something like that. So there is this sort of essential quality of Heathcliff that makes people discriminate against him. And I think we have, you know, I think it is worth noting that element of him. So I think this element plays into the question of their romance too, and the sort of circumstances of their romance and the choice that Kathy has to make. It seems that when they are young, in their sort of glory days together, Heathcliff and Kathy are able to sort of create this other escapist world where none of that matters. You know, none of the discrimination that Heathcliff faces as a non-white person and as a poor person matter in their crag. None of the difficulties that Kathy faces at home or faces as a woman matter. Nothing matters there except for them. They create this sort of, you know, fantasy or this sort of escape where they're sort of this intense bond can flourish, and where the outside world doesn't interfere with it at all. And it seems to me, at least, that Heathcliff leaving that world is a betrayal to Heathcliff. Even if Kathy were to have accepted him when he came back rich, even if she had left Linton and gone to him, I don't think it could have satisfied Heathcliff, because what Heathcliff wanted was their life together in the crag. So, is it a case of true love versus materialism? I think that's one of the dichotomies that the film sets up. We have many stories about characters making this choice between worldly comfort and between a true love. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about Wuthering Heights and makes it such a rich film and story is that usually stories speak to that romantic side that pushes you towards true love, and perhaps this one does as well. But it's complicated because their relationship is tempestuous and kind of violent and kind of dangerous and scary. So anyway, I've spoken I've spoken a lot, so I'll surrender the mic here.
But I think this conversation also, brings up an interesting point that, I imagine was an issue at the time the film was set and the novel was written, and is certainly an issue and a problematic point for Hollywood romances and melodramas for most of Hollywood's existence, which is how readily we as viewers accept the notion that Kathy has to choose one man or the other, right? That there's no sort of third way that lets her pursue passion, even, lets her pursue passion or some other interest. She had, it's not, she has to pursue passion with someone who to me doesn't seem to treat her well. I know that others some in the chat have disagreed, or she has to sort of choose kind of, having no feelings and choose sort of, sustenance or comfort or what have you. And, I don't want to belabor this point too much, because that's the story that is being told, and that's a choice, and that we can take it or leave it. We don't have to watch the film. But the notion that she has to choose one or the other is a construct of sorts, right? And although one perhaps far more authentically limited for, again, the time the film is set and that the novel is written, or the novel is set, than today. But I think it's worth noting that that's a construction, and that's the way the story is set up. David, do you have another question or comment?
Yes, I'm glad we've gotten around. Kathleen's comment earlier, I want to sort of go back to the class issue and that scene where Heathcliff and Kathy together climb over the wall. They both get attacked by the dogs after they're spotted, and the class difference then becomes so dramatic, where she is brought into the house and nursed to health for probably weeks, the way it felt in the movie, given clothing, given everything, given medical care, and he is hauled off. And yet they've come in together. They came in as a couple, and the difference immediately at sight in class is one that I think we've commented on, and it continues today. We make judgments. The book Blink talks about it. Human nature, we make judgments on instant sight, and it's problematic. And yet, it's human nature, and this is sort of a microcosm right there in that what was it, maybe a 2 or 2.5 minute scene to show that. And I just thought that was interesting. I appreciated Kathleen's bringing that in. If you want another subject to talk about the difference, as I compared before, with Darcy constantly, Mr. Darcy constantly giving reasons to dislike him, and Heathcliff, in many respects, with Kathy, goes back and forth in a similar thing. And remember, the audience is watching this in 1939, not today, and how different that view is.
Well, thanks, David. And I think your point, that scene, excuse me, that scene at the beginning of the film with the dog attack, I'm glad you reminded me of that, because I found that striking for two reasons. One being what I consider to be the ferocity and violence of it for what was a relatively genteel time in filmmaking, and what I assumed was going to be a relatively genteel take on this material. The other thing that struck me about it was what you're talking about the very different treatment of those two victims of the dogs. On the one hand, I see very much how the sort of rigid station of him being the stable boy and the servant, and her being the sort of lady of the other house, quote unquote, justifies for the time the difference in treatment. But on the other hand, I would have thought that to show their magnanimity, the Lentons would have wanted to have an appropriate amount of courteousness and accommodation to her, quote unquote, servant, as a courtesy to her. And it struck me that they didn't even have that. Of course, I can also imagine, Heathcliff sort of rebuffing any sort of polite help if he were asked to sort of, place himself on a settee while he was tended to or something. He seemed not to be interested in being, not just not being interested in spending time with those people, but not being sort of, helped or aided by them to some extent as well. Jacob, did you have thoughts on David's last comment?
Yeah, I wanted to speak to the scene of Heathcliff's treatment at the Linton household too. I mean, and to the question of Heathcliff in general, as it's come up in the chat and elsewhere, Heathcliff is somebody who gets described as evil. People also describe him as demonic and various things like that, with sort of as having this almost supernatural dark nature throughout the film. And Heathcliff is a sort of menacing, scary character. He's one of the classic menacing, scary literary characters. But one of the things that I think, I don't think we should reduce him just to that too. This is one of the things that I also think makes Wuthering Heights such a rich text and a rich film, because we are given the means to understand how he came to be the way that he is. He seems to be of a pretty good nature, while the father is still at the head of the household at Wuthering Heights. And then we see the way that he's, treated, the way that he's insulted and abused and insulted, throughout his time there. There's a scene that I think is really skillfully done where Hindley, Kathy's nasty brother, makes Heathcliff give him a boost into his saddle. And we see Heathcliff's hands like this, and we see Hindley's dirty boots step into his hands. And that's just how Heathcliff is treated, throughout the film. That's how the Lintons treat him. They say, you don't belong in this house. And Heathcliff says, I'm going to come back and I'm going to burn this place to the ground, metaphorically speaking. Heathcliff swears revenge on that whole world, and he has it.
What you were saying earlier about the sort of racial or ethnic, perhaps, background or identity of Heathcliff's character got me thinking, and as does this comment in the chat from Josie and Fred, about the question of whether the story of how Heathcliff came to be at the house is completely true, or as they say, could he possibly be an illegitimate son of Kathy's father? and that whole, I found him in Liverpool was a story. If that's true, but even also if, Heathcliff has something other than, quote unquote, white English or British heritage, either of those would be a sufficient reason for his and Kathy's romance to be forbidden at the time. And for that matter, for, I'm drawing a blank on her name, for Geraldine Fitzgerald's romance with him to be poo-pooed as well. I have to say though, and perhaps this is my, my having stars in my eyes and seeing the character played by Laurence Olivier, when I heard the comment when Heathcliff first arrives at Wuthering Heights about him being sort of dark as the devil or dark like the devil or something like that. And I took that to be a reference to the dirt with which he was covered from being what I imagine was a street urchin. I hadn't thought, and I thought the sort of, claims about him being a gypsy I took those more to be about, his spirit and his more bohemian ways and not having any sort of ethnic or racial sort of, comment or commentary attached to them. But when one factors those in, that really adds a whole new dimension to the elements of romance, to how he feels about his ostracization and other things. So I think that's a very important element to keep, and one that obviously for the time the Hollywood film would have had to treat as gingerly as it does.
Right.
So gingerly, in fact, that the person who sort of, has spent more time watching classic Hollywood movies than most people missed it. So that should say something about me, at least, if not the movie.
Can I speak to that, Andrew?
Go ahead.
I think I'm glad that that observation was made. It does seem like a little bit of a fishy story. So, right. So there's various theories about what happened, what's going on with Heathcliff's origins. Some people make a lot of the fact that Liverpool, where he's found, was at that time a major port, including a major slave port. Emily Bronte's father was involved in some early abolition efforts, so she would have had some knowledge of that, of the slave trade. So some people wonder if Heathcliff could be, somebody from the Caribbean or from Africa. Some people speculate that he could be of Roma descent. Some people speculate that he could be from Ireland, as this was the time that the potato famine was going on. And some people, as was suggested, speculate that maybe the story is a little suspicious and he's an illegitimate child. And as Andrew said, this does sort of bring a new angle or a new X factor to the relationship with Kathy. I mentioned before that I think one of the things that makes their relationship simultaneously powerful and scary is that it is this quality of being transcendent, as their love is strong enough that it transcends any border and any boundary and any social prohibition. And it's also transgressive for those same reasons. And so the fact that there is the possibility of some kind of incestuous angle is a piece of that. And it does also, add another possibility for why their relationship could be considered so taboo.
Those are good points, Jacob. Thank you. JD, you have a question or comment?
Yes, hi. Thanks for suggesting this movie. I thought it was great. I've never seen it before. And what I liked about it is there's so many parts of the movie that could be interpreted so differently. For example, the one I took differently that could make Heathcliff good guy or bad guy is it seemed like father brought him home to be a sibling, but it seems like he was treated like a slave. And if he, even as a kid that young, thought he was going to be a sibling, and was in fact turned into the slave for the family, maybe that could have influenced his behavior back and interpreting his behavior back as good or evil.
Yeah.
Also, I wanted to know if you could talk about the ending, because I did read a little bit. It said there were several endings for this movie that were made or discussed, and it was controversial.
Sure, I think that's a really good point. You know, I think the scene, to your point, and to the importance of how that sort of dynamic unfolds, that is why we see as much of them as kids as we do, in part to show where the sort of schism starts between Kathy's brother and him, and how that forecasts what life will be like for him there once the father passes. Indeed, it was pretty brutal before the father passed as well. Regarding the endings, Jacob, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, as I understand it, the way that Wheeler initially ended the film in the cut that played for a preview audience, basically it ended as is, minus the shot of the ghosts of Heathcliff and Kathy walking off together, you know, into the moors. I believe before that it ends with you know, the old doctor, he's old at this point, coming in and saying that he saw Heathcliff and a woman, but there was only one set of footprints, et cetera, et cetera. My understanding is that played for, the film initially ended there. The film played for a test audience who didn't like the ending at all. They found it too grim and too dark. And Samuel Goldwyn, the producer, insisted on adding this other ending. William Wyler, the director, was disgusted by that idea. He refused to shoot it, and in fact, I think they got a second unit. Wyler didn't shoot that last bit. I think they got a second unit director to do it, and as Andrew mentioned before, they found, you know, body doubles or stand-ins to shoot the segment, and they tacked that onto the film. So that's my understanding of the sequence of things.
Yeah, this is a common practice during the era. I mean, another film that we've watched in this series that I believe was suggested by you as well, Jacob, Magnificent Ambersons, ends with you know, two characters after a film that is filled with heartbreak and disappointment, and ends with somebody getting their comeuppance that is so unfortunate that almost nobody watching it could possibly be glad, even though at the beginning you think you will be glad. Ends with two people sort of walking down a hallway, smiling, sort of, you know, almost defiantly, which is completely sort of off point, but is the sort of thing that Hollywood did at this time, even to the point of it almost, or perhaps entirely, not making sense. They felt compelled to give their movies a quote unquote up ending. And that's certainly what happens here. It's not enough to imagine that they might be together despite the single set of footprints. You have to literally spoon feed the audience that they have ended up on some plane of existence together, because the audience can't be left with any question or doubt or disappointment on that note in the thinking of the time. Arlene, you have a question or comment?
Yes. First of all, when the father brought Heathcliff home, he announced to Henley that he's going to sleep in your room. And Henley objected to that. And then the father said, well, you're just going to have to do it. You have to be a bigger person than you are, or something to that effect. And that helped enrage Henley against Heathcliff. And Henley got his revenge against Heathcliff when his father died and put him down to a stable boy. And then throughout the rest of the book and the movie, Heathcliff felt rejected and demeaned, and set out for revenge, particularly after he was rejected by Kathy, who he had dreams of winning. So there was a lot of psychological things going on in addition to whatever racial things were there and what other class things were there. There's a lot of things that go on in a household between siblings or would-be siblings that sometimes the parent has to look at a little bit to see maybe there's some way of making this work better.
Yeah, thank you, Arlene. Yeah, I mean, I think implicit in your comments is a really good point, which is that the father sort of set this dynamic in motion and then seemed, even before he died relatively prematurely, seemed to sort of, you know, wash his hands of it, or at least be hands off about it. You know, once he's, you know, if my son has a friend, goes to a friend's house or something and doesn't want to share his toy, I then tell my son he has to share his toy, but I don't then turn my back and forget about it, right? I make sure, does he actually share the toy, right? And the stakes here are much bigger, and the dynamic here is much more potentially dangerous. And it seems that they're left to their own devices, and you know, which is sort of interesting and doesn't, to my mind, lend a bit more credence to the notion that this wasn't a pure act of altruism, that there was something else going on. Otherwise, you know, one would think he would take a greater interest in Heathcliff, though, of course, you know, there could be other factors as well. Jacob, did you have a comment on that?
I think it's well said, Andrew. You know, I agree that this is a highly psychological work. And though we get the most psychological insight into Heathcliff and into Kathy, we do have glimmers of some of the other characters too. You know, I think that's one thing that makes the film and the story so rich, is because just as you keep considering different elements of it, you know, new surfaces pop out. There's the French filmmaker Jean Renoir once said, "Everybody has their reasons," and in Wuthering Heights, everybody has their reasons.
True. Barbara and Richard Hirsch.
Hi, Andrew. Hi, Jacob. It's Richard.
Hi.
Could we talk a little bit, or could you comment a bit about the characters of Ellen and Joseph? We haven't talked much about them. They often sit as the third corner of triangles in a lot of the dyad relationships, but also, since we've talked a lot about class, they seem to me to sit in the middle place in the class ladder. If Heathcliff's proverbially at the bottom for whatever reasons, I think Jacob's, you know, named those in terms of othering him. They seem to sort of sit, you know, in British society, English society, in their proper place. They see things, they see wisely, and they're more often than not powerless to do much more than what they're told at the end of the day, but they persevere. And they seem to me to sort of be like the centrist position between the evil characters and, you know, the benevolent characters. So I'm just wondering if you wanted to comment on the role of those two. And I thought they were outstanding performances by both of the actors in those roles.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a really thoughtful and wonderful comment. Jacob, do you have thoughts on what Richard suggested?
Certainly, I'm glad you brought it up, Richard. I'm going to speak more to the character of Nellie than Joseph, although he's interesting too, just because we get a little bit more of Nellie in the film. Now, it's interesting because she is not only a player in the story, she's also the narrator for much of it. She's the one telling the story. In the book, those of you who've read it know that there's various literary things that are done to signify that she might be an unreliable narrator in certain ways. Here, less so, but nonetheless, I think it's valuable. She plays a valuable function because she's somebody who is kind of grounded, as you say, Richard, who can kind of let us into the story in a way that is hard to do with the character if we were, you know, hearing it from Heathcliff or if we were hearing it from Kathy, both of whom have such extreme personalities. It reminds me, one of the scenes or the small moments in the film that I think is really telling is that there's an instance where Heathcliff, having remade himself and done what he needs to do to at least get in the door of the Linton mansion, attends a dance, and you see various characters who are at this dance at the Linton's house socializing with one another. Heathcliff enters. He sees Nellie on the stairs, and that's who he greets. He says, "Hi, Nellie." And so he's signifying this sort of kinship or relationship, or in some ways perhaps even a parody of sorts between them, in a way that he doesn't with the other genteel folks. And I think that's a sort of interesting grounding for the character too. Did you have thoughts, Andrew?
Yeah, I think the observation about those two characters occupying this sort of middle tier is really, really on point, and really, really interesting, and an important reminder for the film. I mean, as you say, it's critical that Nellie's the narrator, and it makes a lot of sense that she is present for most of, if not all of, the pivotal moments. But I think it's interesting, of course, because their status as workers or servants, but long-standing ones, gives them a sort of status elevated above Heathcliff, and they are given a lot more latitude and are listened to, or at least their thoughts are considered more, and they feel some liberty to speak up to or speak out to their employers. And that, of course, allows them to kind of present this voice of fairness or rationality or reasonableness, or pick your more moderated term than the whatever's motivating the passions or bigotries or conflicts that the rest of the characters seem to have. They don't seem to have a stake in those. And we've seen a story where there's a servant who has an elevated status and picks a side. I think of Rebecca, another movie starring Laurence Olivier as a romantic lead of questionable moral background and behavior. And she clearly has a side and clearly leverages her position. Mrs. Danvers does. In this film, we don't see that. We see them, really being these voices of reason and pragmatism, and trying to be moderating influences, though they are rarely listened to in those capacities.
Indeed, but but then again, by the same token, Wuthering Heights is full of then agains, and one of the then agains here is that we're hearing this story secondhand. So, in these characters who are
right.
of almost mythic extremity, who have these larger than life personalities and these, larger than life relationships. It's getting retold. We're not seeing it as a firsthand viewer. We're hearing it as a secondhand listening. So one has to ask, is there something here that we don't understand? Is there something here that we're not seeing? Is there an element that's being downplayed? So it's complicated.
And I'm sure that's true of the novel. It would be very uncharacteristic of Hollywood in 1939 to expect us to not take what the narrator is telling us as the truth of the story. But you make a good point. Once that layer is added, and it is added by choice, I mean, they could have constructed the film another way. Then we do have a right to wonder were Heathcliff and Kathy really this tempestuous? Were Joseph and Nellie really that sort of those stand-up people, or were they embellishing their own place in the story? Right? I guess that's always a possibility. So that's a good point. But this has been I think a wonderful discussion of a very interesting movie, a movie that clearly has a lot of fodder for different interpretations, which is one of the great things about talking about movies. It's just not something we, to my mind, we very often see in Hollywood movies from 1939. So I'm glad it worked out. Jacob, thank you for suggesting this. And thank you all for joining us as well. We are doing this pretty much every Monday night. If you, in addition to these on Mondays, we have our remote classroom seminars on select Tuesdays, including one tomorrow night, taught by Lisa DeKnight on Fritz Lang, the German director's work in Hollywood. You can see a number of other ones we have scheduled as well. If you want to keep up with the goings on with Bryn Mawr Film Institute's Film Studies Online, you can sign up for our emails. Every Thursday, we send out the education email that has everything you need to know for the discussion the following Monday, as well as all sorts of other informative and engaging film content. In addition, there is our Theater 5 section where you can screen brand new films, including some of the award contenders for the upcoming Oscars right in your own home. And these are only available through theaters like Bryn Mawr Film Institute. So please check out the Theater 5 section as well. And we look forward to seeing you down the line for future programs, be they films or education. And we very much appreciate your support by participating and engaging and making your purchases, and by being members for those of you who are. And if you have the means to support us additionally as we work towards our public reopening, we would greatly appreciate any support you can offer. I also want to mention that the theater is available for private small group rentals at very reasonable rates. So if you're hankering to go see a movie in the theater, as I'm sure a number of you are, visit brynmawrfilm.org to check out the availability of those. It's really a great opportunity to get back to the movies that we all love. Until next time, thank you all so much for joining us.
Farewell.
Take care.
Thank you both again.
Hi, everyone. That was awesome. Thank you.